There are new bombshell claims today from royal insiders who say King Charles's cancer is incurable and he will likely die with the disease.
This is an original fictional drama. King Edmund, Prince Alaric, and all other characters, places, and events depicted are entirely fictional and are not based on any real person, living or dead. For 3 weeks, Prince Alaric had carried a truth too painful to speak and too dangerous to conceal. Then, behind closed doors at Faircliff Palace, he finally stopped protecting the silence. His voice faltered only once as he confirmed to his wife that King Edmund was gravely unwell, that treatment had failed to deliver the recovery everyone had hoped for, and that the physicians had told the family his illness could no longer be cured. Alaric had avoided this moment for days. In public, the prince answered questions with careful phrases, thanked well-wishers, and moved toward his next duty. But every controlled response hid the same fear. His father's condition was changing faster than the palace could admit. The royal household, the staff and advisors who organized the monarch's public and constitutional work, had begun quietly reconsidering ceremonies, state visits, and the machinery of succession. Edmund's illness was no longer only a private medical battle. It was reshaping the throne itself. Alaric gathered his wife, Princess Rosalind, and 2 senior advisors inside a sitting room at Faircliff Palace. He placed a folded medical summary on the table and said the words plainly. The doctors had concluded that the illness could no longer be cured. Treatment would continue to slow its progress, to protect what comfort remained, but a cure was no longer the goal. He did not sit. Instead, he gripped the back of a chair until his knuckles whitened. Rosalind watched his face change. She stepped beside him, but he looked away, unable to bear the sympathy in her eyes. For months he had tried to behave like an heir preparing for duty. In that room, he was only a son, confronting the loss of his father. Rosalind touched his arm, and he admitted that speaking the truth aloud had made everything suddenly feel irreversible. Then the summary revealed something worse. Edmund had learned the full prognosis nearly 2 weeks earlier and had asked his staff to delay telling Alaric until after an important state visit was completed. The king had also begun quietly rewriting his own schedule, removing the engagements that exhausted him most, while stubbornly keeping the handful he refused to give up. Alaric stared at the revised pages, then set them down slowly. His voice dropped as he asked whether his father was preparing for fewer duties or preparing the family to say goodbye. To understand why those words wounded Alaric so deeply, it helps to understand the bond between this father, this son, and the crown that had always stood between them. The public saw a king facing illness and an heir preparing to succeed him. Alaric felt something far more complicated. He saw the father whose approval he had spent a lifetime chasing, resisting, and quietly needing. Every old disagreement now felt sharper. Every unfinished conversation carried new weight, shadowed by one unbearable possibility, that the crown might reach him only because his father could no longer carry it. Alaric had spent years learning to speak to Edmund without letting old wounds enter every sentence. Their relationship had been shaped by duty, loss, and the opposing instincts of 2 men who loved the same institution differently. Edmund believed the crown demanded discipline above all. Alaric believed it also demanded change. Their arguments had usually been about the monarchy's future, but now the prince wondered whether he'd spent too much energy challenging the king and too little trying to understand the man underneath the title. Rosalind saw what her husband wouldn't admit. His growing workload wasn't only preparation for greater responsibility. It was an attempt to outrun fear. She watched him take on more meetings, read longer briefing papers, and fill every quiet hour with work, because silence left room for thoughts he couldn't control. Edmund carried a different fear. He worried that his son's compassion might tip into hesitation when hard decisions arrived. He wanted Alaric ready, not for a funeral, but for reign. Yet every conversation about continuity sounded to Alaric like surrender. Every mention of readiness felt like his father quietly saying goodbye. Alaric found a handwritten note at Ashworth, the family's country estate, tucked inside an old briefing folder. Edmund had written months earlier that he was proud of the man his son had become, praising, in a few plain lines, how calmly Alaric had handled a difficult public engagement. The prince read the note twice. His hands trembled as he closed the folder, because the approval he had quietly wanted for years had finally reached him at the exact moment he feared losing the man who wrote it. Later, Rosalind told him something she'd learned from a private conversation with the king. That Edmund had asked her, specifically, to make sure Alaric didn't isolate himself when the pressure became unbearable. It was proof in its own quiet way that the king had been preparing emotionally, and not only for the paperwork of succession. Long before Alaric said any of this aloud, there had been a moment the palace could not fully erase. It happened during a private investiture at Ashworth Hall, a ceremony in which the monarch presents honors to citizens recognized for service to the kingdom. Every gesture in such a room carries meaning, which is exactly why what happened mattered so much. Edmund reached for a medal, lost his balance, and froze beside the chair prepared for him. The room went silent. Alaric stepped forward instinctively. His father raised one hand and stopped him, a gesture that was proud, frightened, and absolute all at once. It was the moment, more than any conversation, when everything changed. Edmund had insisted on continuing his duties through the hardest stretches of treatment, refusing to let illness become the defining image of his reign. Palace staff, without ever saying so plainly, had already begun adapting around him, shorter. Receiving lines, engagements scheduled closer together, quiet rest periods built into the day, chairs placed in rooms where the king had once stood unaided for hours. The ceremony pressed forward. Edmund reached for a second medal. His fingers missed it. His knees weakened. Alaric caught his arm before he fell. His father whispered only 2 words, "Not here," then pulled himself upright and insisted the ceremony continue. Alaric obeyed, but anger burned under his silence. Duty, he realized, had stopped protecting his father. It had started endangering him. Edmund felt something different, humiliation. His son had just witnessed the exact moment his body stopped answering his command, and some part of him, unfairly, understandably, couldn't forgive that weakness in himself. He finished the ceremony through sheer will, offering steady words to every recipient, while Alaric watched each breath and every careful movement. Alaric followed his father into an adjoining room the moment the last guest left. He demanded the truth, how many times this had happened before, and why no one had told him. Edmund struck the arm of his chair and told his son he needed to learn the difference between loving a sovereign and managing an institution. Alaric answered that no institution was worth watching his father collapse to protect appearances. A physician arrived before either man could retreat from the argument, insisting on an immediate and complete assessment. It was that assessment which eventually led to the prognosis Alaric would later have to share with the world. Worse, Alaric learned that this had happened before. Smaller episodes, quietly described to staff as ordinary fatigue, kept out of the official record to protect the king's privacy. The silence, he understood now, hadn't started that afternoon. It had been carefully built around him for months. Days later, father and son faced each other again. No ceremony, no guests, no excuses left to hide behind. Alaric entered without bowing. He didn't open with duty. He asked the question that had been building since the ceremony. Why had everyone else known how ill his father truly was before he did? Edmund, seated by the window with an unopened file on his knees, answered honestly for the first time. Uncertainty, he said, could become its own prison, and he had wanted, however wrongly, to protect his son and grandchildren from living under a countdown medicine couldn't measure. His voice dropped as he admitted the real reason for the silence. He could not bear to watch hope disappear from his son's face. The confession landed harder than any argument could have. Alaric's anger finally broke. He told his father that the secrecy hadn't spared him pain. It had stolen days they might have spent speaking honestly, repairing old wounds, facing the fear together instead of alone. He sat, finally, though the distance between them still felt enormous. Edmund told him something else that night, that he had recorded private messages, sealed, meant only for his family, meant to remain unopened unless his condition sharply worsened. He wanted his voice to reach the people he loved, even if illness later took away his ability to speak to them directly. And then he told Alaric about the transition plan he had already signed. Not an abdication, but a quiet, controlled transfer of certain duties meant to prevent any sudden shock to the kingdom if his health worsened without warning. Alaric asked who had authorized it, expecting to hear it had come from doctors or officials. His father said only that he had decided it himself, before anyone else even knew the full truth of his prognosis. The document made no dramatic declaration. It surrendered nothing officially. But Edmund's signature quietly shifted the balance of the crown's daily work, giving Alaric greater authority over major engagements and communication with senior officials, not because his father was stepping down, but because he was trying in the only way he knew how to prepare his son while still holding on himself. Edmund sat alone with the final page for a long time before he signed it. He worried that once Alaric began chairing meetings and standing in for him at major events, the public would start to see him as already gone. Alaric, across the palace, feared the opposite, that accepting more authority would look like ambition at the cruelest possible moment, as if he were reaching for the crown while his father still fought to hold it. Rosalind supported the arrangement, but understood its cost. Alaric's aunt, Princess Wilhelmina, was given a quieter, harder role, overseeing the handover itself, precisely because she could challenge both men without needing anything for herself. She understood immediately that this wasn't a reward. It was a burden meant to keep grief, fear, and pride from damaging what needed to be done carefully. One clause mattered more than any other. No public timetable for succession would ever be announced. Edmund refused to let a prognosis become a prophecy. Alaric signed his own acceptance only after adding a handwritten promise of his own, that every duty transferred to him would still be carried out in his father's name. The first real consequence of the plan appeared on a revised engagement sheet. Edmund's name had been quietly removed from a major diplomatic reception and replaced with his son's, a sensible, doctor-approved decision, accepted without argument by the household. But when Edmund saw the amended page, he simply stared at the blank space where his own role used to sit. For the first time, all of this stopped being theoretical. His absence had been written, in plain ink, into the kingdom's near future. He asked his equerry, the officer who managed his daily schedule, how long the substitution had been planned. Since the most recent consultation, came the answer. Edmund said nothing. He only looked again at the empty line, wounded by the knowledge that others had already begun preparing for his absence while he was still fighting, every day, to remain present. Alaric wanted to refuse the appearance entirely. He told Rosalind that stepping into his father's place would feel like occupying a space that didn't belong to him yet. She told him that refusing would force Edmund to choose between protecting his health and protecting the crown, and that real loyalty sometimes meant accepting a burden the person you love can no longer carry, even when it feels like betrayal to take it from them. At the reception, Alaric paused beside his father's designated chair. He touched the back of it, then chose to stand while delivering his remarks, refusing to give even the appearance of having taken his father's seat. Partway through, an aide handed him a note. Edmund had watched the broadcast from Ashworth despite his exhaustion. The note praised the speech and added one instruction: do not apologize for doing what duty requires. Alaric folded the note carefully. The words stayed with him for the rest of the night. That evening, Alaric drove to Ashworth without any aides, determined to trade polished language for an honest conversation about fear. He found his father seated beside a small table, 2 untouched cups of tea between them. For once, the future king didn't ask about schedules or treatment plans. He sat across from his father and said simply, "I'm frightened. And I think you are too." Edmund didn't deny it. What followed was the most unguarded conversation either man could remember having. Edmund admitted that death wasn't his only fear. He feared losing his independence, becoming a burden, being spoken about as though he were no longer in the room. Most of all, he feared that illness would become the final chapter people remembered, erasing every year of work that came before it. Alaric listened without interrupting. His father had spent a lifetime hiding vulnerability behind duty and careful composure. Now, for the first time, none of that armor was left. Alaric confessed something of his own, something darker. Part of him resented the crown, because it had turned his father's suffering into a kind of schedule for his own advancement. Every duty he accepted proved he was ready, and every proof of readiness was also proof his father couldn't do it anymore. He admitted he hated feeling capable on the days his father felt weakest. Edmund reached across the table and put his hand over his son's. Becoming king, he said, would never mean replacing him. It would mean carrying forward everything they had finally learned to say to each other. Compassion without hesitation, duty without silence, leadership that didn't have to pretend pain wasn't real. He told Alaric not to preserve every tradition, simply because his father had preserved it. Build a reign that fits your own conscience, he said. Not mine. Alaric moved to the chair beside his father instead of across from him. Neither spoke for a while. The distance that had defined their last several conversations was finally gone. By morning, that quiet reconciliation became the foundation for a message meant to reach the entire country. At 9 o'clock, broadcasters interrupted their programming to display a statement carrying Alaric's name. The wording was careful, but its meaning was unmistakable. The king's condition was serious, treatment would continue, and the family was preparing, together, for whatever came next. The statement protected the private clinical details. It did not hide the truth beneath them. Crowds gathered outside the palace gates. A woman left a handwritten card beneath the railings. You served while afraid. Now let us stand with you. Others stopped beside it. Flowers began to gather until one small note became a quiet wall of support. People didn't gather because they believed a monarchy could defeat illness. They gathered because for the first time, the family had openly admitted that service and fear could exist in the same person at once. Edmund watched the coverage from Ashworth. When the cameras showed the card at the gate, he asked an aide to preserve it rather than let it be swept away with the flowers. He had feared being remembered only through his illness. Instead, he was watching people respond to the humanity he'd spent so long trying to conceal. The disclosure didn't cure Edmund. It didn't stop the clock, and it didn't remove the fear that waited behind every appointment. What had changed was the silence. Edmund no longer faced his illness as a sovereign trying to shield an institution from appearing weak. Alaric no longer carried the truth alone, as a son too frightened to grieve openly. The crown remained standing, not because it hid its pain, but because, for once, the family let that pain be seen. Treatment continued, aimed now at comfort and time rather than a cure. Edmund stopped treating every canceled engagement as a defeat. He began to understand, slowly, that service could change shape without losing its meaning. Alaric permanently took on a larger working role, but he refused to describe it as a replacement. Every speech, every decision was carried out in support of his father, not in anticipation of his absence. Father and son stopped hiding behind schedules and formal language. They started speaking plainly about fear, regret, love, and the limited time neither of them could control. The honesty didn't erase the pain. It simply stopped that pain from pulling them apart. Rosalind helped her husband understand something he'd needed to hear for a long time. That strength doesn't require silence, and that grief spoken aloud isn't weakness. Alaric finally believed her. Weeks after the announcement, Alaric found his father in his study, reviewing a speech. Edmund pointed to a single line and asked whether it sounded too sentimental. Alaric read it slowly, smiled through something close to tears, and told him no. Say exactly what you mean this time. Edmund left the line as it was. In the finished speech, he told the kingdom that service was never measured by pretending to be unbreakable, only by offering whatever strength remained, honestly and with gratitude. The words became more than a message. They became the quiet lesson underneath everything that had happened. The crown survived not because it clung to the old idea that dignity required distance from feeling, but because a father and a son finally chose honesty over the silence that had almost cost them each other. This story, its characters, and its royal family are entirely fictional inventions created for this piece, and do not depict real people or real events.